Hello, and welcome to the 2020 Comics and Popular Arts Conference, part of this year's virtual DragonCon convention. My name is Emanuel Berkowitz, and I have a degree in pedagogy, which is the art and science of teaching and learning, and I work in the field of education. I specialize in education that occurs in non-traditional learning environments. And there are a whole variety of non-traditional learning environments that intersect with a lot of the other presentations that you might be seeing as part of the Comics and Popular Arts Conference that fall under the umbrella of what we call fan literacies. For example, my doctoral dissertation was on fan fiction practices. Now, however, I focus much more on learning environments that relate to graphic novels and comics. I have a book coming out this fall, for instance, called Framing School Violence and Bullying in Young Adult Manga. And in that book, I look at how bullying and violence between classmates and teenage romantic partners is portrayed within Japanese graphic novels that are translated and distributed in international markets. So, as you can imagine, I spend a lot of time thinking and talking about the content of graphic novels. And I think a lot of us do. For example, we talk a lot about how the death of Superman was really influential on how death is portrayed within comic books media and within US media in general. How we have all of these fictional properties with characters that are worth millions and millions of dollars, and the idea that audiences would expect that the companies would be willing to kill these characters off. It requires some mental gymnastics and requires some very tricky writing to get the right emotional reactions from readers. We talk a lot in the Transformers comics community about how the character of RC has radically transformed in the past few decades, depending on who is writing her in the comics continuity, and how she's a very important character as the first ever Transformer who was a woman in transitioning Transformers from a group of characters who their gender doesn't matter because they're robots from space to their gender doesn't matter, but this one's a woman. And what that means for people collecting the toys, especially women collecting the toys who now have, going from it doesn't matter what their gender is to this is the one for you. It's a very interesting transformation that we like to talk about and sometimes talk about very loudly or angrily on message boards. We also like to talk, especially recently, about how Marvel Comics in the 90s and the 80s, and even now to some extent, really isn't the best at portraying their African American characters, and how the writers often don't have the necessary or the proper experiences with African Americans to write someone who is, in the words of some readers, they would argue are not believably African American characters, for whatever that means. That, of course, is a loaded term, but the point is that we have a lot of discussions, and we tend to have them when we're not at conventions like DragonCon. We tend to have these discussions in online environments. Now, within the field of education, we refer to message boards and Discord and Twitch comment sections as digital media literacy. It's a type of learning environment that really has only become possible since the mid to late 90s because of the ubiquity of the internet as an affordable means of communication. And as the decades have progressed, digital learning environments have become much more important for the way that we understand the ways that people teach and learn in social situations, in informal situations, now much more formal situations, because we have a lot more formal classes that are happening in these digital environments. What does it mean to go to a college class and have a comment section for that college class? You can talk to the other students while the teacher is still talking on Zoom. So there's a great deal of discussion, and especially within media literacy and within critical media literacy, there's a lot more focus on the news side of things. On if you've heard the term fake news, that is a critical media literacy term. How can we tell if someone is interviewing someone that they're accurately reporting what the person they're interviewing is saying? How can we tell where they got their sources or what bias they might have? That tends to be the more journalistic side of media literacy. Whereas what I tend to focus on is the more entertainment side of media literacy. And in my journey as an academic, I eventually found myself within the context of libraries and the role that libraries play within media literacy. And in that exploration, I came into contact with a lot of librarians who work within U.S. prisons. Now, here in New York, we have a lot of state prisons, like a lot of states, and many of those prisons have libraries and library staff within them. And in meeting with some of these library staff, I had mentioned, due to my work on graphic novels and Japanese graphic novels, that the graphic novel series, the manga series Dragon Ball, had a lot of interesting interplay between the characters and their sons, and had a lot to say about absent fathers. And the librarians thought this was interesting and asked if I could come in and volunteer within the New York State Libraries to lead discussion groups about these titles. So several years later, and over a dozen successful outreach sessions, I'm coming to you to talk about how I used graphic novels to overcome obstacles to media literacy education within U.S. prisons. Now, as a bit of a background, we have over 2 million citizens currently incarcerated in U.S. correctional facilities. And within these facilities, many of our most commonplace media practices are limited or restricted. Um, they have television, but they might not have internet. They definitely have a very restricted form of internet, and even the books that they have available to them are very restricted. Um, Many of these inmates have been there for a decade or more, and the world outside of these facilities and the way media works in the world outside these facilities has really changed since they've been in there. And without adequate media literacy education, if you release someone who's been in prison for 25 years and they need to have, this is a more of an extreme example, but some jobs you need to have a LinkedIn page to apply to them. How if they've never used a smartphone before, there are some jobs that they just are going to be at a disadvantage because they don't know how to use a touch screen. Um, so media literacy is a really important part of the process of bringing reformed inmates back into the greater society. And there's also an argument to be made that anyone in the United States should have access to the same level of education about how we consume media and how we can critically consume media. And one of the reasons why I feel that graphic novels are so important for uh, for this process is that graphic novels, well, first, they often require a lower reading level or a lower or less of a perfect grasp of language because of their visual components. There are a lot of arguments within the field of graphic novel studies about what this means and how the sequence, how graphic novels transform words into speech and speech into words. And we're not really going to get into that here, but it is something that people talk about a lot, how graphic novels are read differently. And are one of the reasons why they're often so popular with children is that you can target a much wider range of reading levels with a single work when you're talking about these kinds of graphic novels. Another reason why they're so interesting is that they are multimedia franchises often. So when I talk about using Dragon Ball, Dragon Ball is not only a manga series, a very long manga series of dozens and dozens of volumes that is still ongoing today, but it also was a TV show. There have been Dragon Ball video games. There was a Dragon Ball card game. So even if I hold a session, a discussion session about Dragon Ball and about the role that how Dragon Ball portrays uh, moral depictions of fathers who are absent parents, or about cycles of violence that are generational. I don't need to expect that someone's going to have read dozens and dozens of volumes of Dragon Ball before they come to the discussion session because maybe they're familiar with the television show. Maybe they'll be able to have a conversation about Goku, the main character of Dragon Ball, and his relationship with his son Gohan, and how really Goku's rival Piccolo is more of a father figure to Gohan at times than Goku is. You can get that from just a few episodes of the television show. You don't have to read the whole book series. So being a multimedia franchise is very integral to some of these titles' appeal. One of the titles where it's most important in talking about media literacy is in The Walking Dead. Now, The Walking Dead is always, whenever I go into a facility, it's the most requested title that people want to talk about. They know it's a graphic novel, they've seen the show, and they know that the book is very different between the show and the comic. And one of the main ways in which it is different, not certainly not the biggest way, but one of the main ways is in its portrayal of its minority characters. Oftentimes, the most important minority characters are more stereotypically portrayed in the Hollywood version of Walking Dead and are more three-dimensional in the comic version. So part of media literacy is talking about when a story is adapted into a different medium, what are the constraints of that medium? How does that medium change the way the characters are presented? What does that say about how Hollywood wants, for example, Michonne, who is the most prominent African American woman in the story, is much more defined by her violence in the show and is much more defined by her intellect in the comic. Now, one of the ways you can discuss that with inmates is talking about how they feel their experiences within broader media. How when they see black women portrayed in media, is it always the same portrayal? Do all black women of a certain age get portrayed a certain way? When we were talking earlier about Marvel's Darkhold, we can see in the corner there we have the old black woman who gives all the prophecies and is very closely tied with voodoo. But that's one of the very few ways that old black women are portrayed within 1990s Marvel Comics. And so drawing into that broader cultural knowledge can be very important. It can be important when we talk about one of the works that I like to talk about is Crisis on Infinite Earths. It is a not really self-contained, but self-contained in a certain way storyline where all of the DC comic characters from the 1980s cross over. It's one of the most frequently discussed crossovers within superhero comics. So the important aspect of that is that we have Superman in here, we have Batman in here, we have Wonder Woman, and you have more than one version of each of these characters. Part of the appeal of Crisis on Infinite Earths is there are hundreds of Supermen all coming from different realities. Well, what does it mean for there to be Superman and then a different Superman? Is Superman different? Is Superman a different character in the movies than he is in the comics? And what does that mean that he's a different character? And how can you tell that they're the same Superman? Well, that's an important part of media literacy in talking about our expectations of characters. There are a few more books that I'm going to go through quickly that I've done very successfully. One of them is the Death Note series. Death Note talks a lot about the nature of justice, what it means to live a just life, and what it means to opt into society's rules, to follow the rules of society, or to try to shape them and say that you believe that your idea of justice is more important than the laws that are set out. It's very interesting to inmates to see a character who's trying to redefine society and the way that he tries to make society more just is to kill criminals who society has chosen not to kill. That he believes that in much more extreme capital punishment, inmates react to that very differently than, say, the 14-year-old readers who Death Note was originally written for. One of the titles that really strongly resonates is Representative John Lewis's trilogy March. And this is about the civil rights movement. It goes over Selma. It's 3 books. There was a plan to continue it on with John Lewis's political career. That obviously there's gonna be some reconsidering whether or not the series is gonna go forth now. But this is really all the parts of the civil rights movement that we don't teach in schools, but you would be surprised that we don't, are in here. And it's really, for a lot of African American inmates, the idea that this is a part of their country's history, some of which they lived through, some of which they were some people were in prison during the time that John Lewis was sent to prison, and their comparison of why he was sent to prison versus why they were sent to prison is very interesting. and they find it very interesting to read and discuss it. One of the things that I like to do is start with a work like March, which is very specific to the U.S. Experience, and then go a little further away. So, talking about graphic novels, most people will talk about Mouse, which is one of the most critically celebrated graphic novels in mainstream culture. It deals with so in here, if you aren't familiar, it's a sort of Disneyfied art style version of the story of Auschwitz, the story of the Holocaust, where in order to make it a little bit less disturbing, all of the Nazis are cats and all of the Jews are mice, and so there's a little bit of a veneer, a little bit of a facade where even if you are not specifically focused on the Jewish experience here, the experience of oppression, of these cats oppressing these mice, and of course everything is based on real stories, so there's always the reminder that this really happened, can be a really interesting story, especially for we all know that correctional facilities have a lot of radicalization, have a lot of very extremist views, and providing a space where people can talk about issues like the Holocaust in a library instead of with people who might have violent reactions to discussions about it or might have more unsympathetic reactions to people who want to discuss these issues is a really a strength of outreach programs within correctional facility libraries, presenting a correctional facility library as a space where intellectual discussion can happen. Very briefly, there are two more works in the same vein. Persepolis, which is about Iran, specifically the women's experiences in Iran, is a really important work that I feel should be included in any correctional facility curriculum, especially because I had multiple inmates in male prisons who told me that this was the first work they ever read that was written by a woman. I thought that was so interesting, and the fact that that keeps on coming up really told me that this is really an important work to talk about. Similarly, another topic that we don't think very much about within U.S. education is the internment of the Japanese during World War II. So George Takei, who many of us know as the one of the stars of Star Trek, wrote about his own experiences as a boy within the U.S. Japanese internment camps. And this is a more recent work, but as I'm about to discuss, more recent works are sometimes a little harder to harder to get enough copies within the correctional facilities, but these are already starting to really circulate, and you can get enough copies of this within a lot of systems. Now, I mentioned that in order to talk about what books you should probably avoid. Now, correctional facilities sometimes have access to their greater library systems card catalogs, to the reserve systems. They can order books from the local public libraries. But this doesn't mean that you can just do any book that a library will have, because you have to have enough copies. As much as I would like to do A Contract with God, and as celebrated as this work is as really the first U.S. graphic novel, there just aren't enough copies in circulation within a lot of districts to do a discussion of this book. Similarly, more recent books, like A Silent Voice, maybe in a few years there will be enough copies of this work, which is about a romance between a deaf girl and the boy who years before had bullied her in elementary school. But it's just too new, and you can't get all 7 volumes of it reliably and get enough of those for everybody. Now, similarly, something like the Cowboy Wally show, it's been in print so many different times, but very limited run. This one's distributed by Marlowe and Company, and a lot of libraries aren't as that's not as readily available as something that maybe DC will put out. As a general rule, if you have something that you spent years hunting down on eBay, you can just forget being able to use that as a discussion topic. There's also content guidelines. That's a really important part when you go into correctional facilities, is that you might think that something like Sailor Moon is innocuous, but this cover is going to prevent this book from getting into correctional facilities simply because once the person in charge of screening the books realizes that this girl is a middle school student, this is just not appropriate, especially considering the nature of some of the crimes that these inmates have committed. there's, within the books, O Maidens in Your Savage Season has a lot of depictions of sexuality between underage students. That's not going to be appropriate. And things that might surprise you about appropriateness. Watchmen, which you would think would be one of the first graphic novels you would discuss in any kind of critical or academic context, has a scene of a prison break in it, or an attempted prison break. That's automatically going to mean you're not going to be able to use this within a prison environment. Um, so there are obviously exceptions. You would think that because there's so much violence occurring within correctional facilities, within Walking Dead, I mean, a huge chunk of the beginning of the story, they're hiding in the prison and fighting all the zombies. But that slipped in. Some titles are just available, even though you would think they wouldn't be. So you really have to be flexible. That's the most important part of going into correctional facilities. After the fact that really it is much safer to go in and volunteer in a correctional facility than anyone would think. It is not. It should not be viewed as an intimidating thing to go in and volunteer. It's you are, even in maximum security facilities where there are people there who have done, you know, to put it bluntly, places where serial killers are. You will be safe as a volunteer going in, so you shouldn't let that dissuade you. But also, the other important point is that you should be flexible because you're coming in. You shouldn't go in thinking that you're going to change the whole system as a big activist. This is activism in its own way, but you are working within one of the most strict and rigid systems that has ever been created in a first world country. It is a very, very carefully ordered, and the restrictions might change between the time that you schedule your session and you go in to volunteer. There might be new rules, and you just have to roll with them because otherwise you're not going to go in. So I do encourage people who are interested, even if you're just interested in talking about graphic novels with people and your friends are sick of you talking about X-Men with them, maybe what you want to do is find an audience who really wants an outlet for talking about media or talking about issues that they might have. Maybe they want to talk about the civil rights movement, but they don't know anyone in prison who they'd feel comfortable bringing up the subject with. Making the libraries in prisons a space where discussions can happen is one of the most vital things that you can do as a volunteer. So we're a little bit over time, and I'd like to thank you. If you want more information, my email address is drew, D-R-E-W, .e.berkowitz @gmail.com. And I would encourage anyone who'd like to know more about volunteering to send me any questions or comments that they have. And please enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much for watching.